Gur mágad a hirla gníomhigh agus bála me dús bóire mo fáilte a chur ribh an bille ach freisin ribh an ara agus a chugóirdeachas a buint léí agus fáilte ras don Ryan Dlí agus Curto tá mí léir sásta chu echo síochán a ríist. There's a lot to unpack in this bill, and I think, Minister, you've covered a lot of the material that's there, but I think what's important about this is to dispel much of the opposition that has been put to this online and in the ether, I think almost all of which is ill-founded and misplaced. There have been legitimate questions raised about the bill, and I intend to address them as well. But I think on the whole, and on behalf of the Fine Gael Group, we have to welcome this legislation as being a progressive movement towards saying to people in Ireland who fall within the protected characteristics outlined at the beginning of the bill that we support their right, the same as anybody else's, to peaceably enjoy the space that they have in Ireland, in their homes, on the public streets, in schools, in their workplace, wherever it might be, and that we as a legislature and we as a state recognise that there is no basis and there is never an acceptable level at which people can render hate against any person because of who they are or what they are or whatever that might be. And that's what's at the heart of this bill. This bill is not about stifling debate. It's about taking hatred out of debate. As you said, Minister, it's not about saying to people, you may no longer be offensive, you may no longer offend. Unfortunately, including members in this House, they can continue to offend and be offensive for many, many years to come without committing any offence. This bill is really specific in what it does. And I would like the senators who are speaking against this bill today and who are telling people publicly they're going to vote against this, to tell us, first of all, are they opposed to legislation against hate speech in the first instance, or is it just this bill? And if it's just this bill, what is it that they would take out that would not render the bill toothless, but to still have it as an effective measure to support people in specific protected characteristics? So if you're voting against this bill today, tell us why. Don't give us the rubbish that we've been seeing online about the things you've mentioned, Minister, about removing freedom of expression or speech, overturning the burden of proof. I'm going to come to each of them. And don't give us that. Tell us if you're either in favour of legislation against hate speech or you aren't. And if you aren't in favour, that's one thing. If you are in favour, how is it you would do it differently? So let's look at some of the things that we've seen floating around in respect to this bill. Firstly, Minister, can I say I welcome the repeal of the Prohibition of Incitement to Hatred Act 1989. Its time has come. It came probably many years ago. 50 prosecutions in 30 years shows us just how ineffective that piece of legislation was. But more importantly, times have changed. In 1989, everybody didn't have the internet in their pocket. Kids didn't have the internet. It wasn't everywhere. You mentioned the example of the assault in Navan. These are things that didn't exist in 1989. And so it is absolutely appropriate that this legislation be updated to address situations like that, and that's why I welcome the expansion of the scope of the bill to information systems provided for in Section 6, subsection 1. It's also important to remember that people have been saying that this removes our freedom of speech. Members of this chamber have said online today that this bill is going to remove freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Nothing could be further from the truth. Firstly, everybody in this country's right to freedom of expression is protected, as you said, by Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. If not that, then by Section 40 of the Constitution of this country. If not that, by Section 11 of this very bill, it protects it. But if not that, all of the fair procedures measures within our courts are still there to protect anyone accused of an offence under this bill. So go away with your nonsense about removing freedom of expression. That is not true, it is misleading, and it is grossly irresponsible. That's the first point. The second one then is this thing about thought policing. Nothing again in this bill affects anyone's thought. You can continue to think offensive and wrong and moronic things if you want to do so. You're still not committing an offence, no matter how hateful they are. What becomes an offence is when you turn those thoughts into action. When you go out onto the streets of Ireland, when you talk to your neighbours, your friends, your co-workers, and you express hatred towards them, or you express hatred to another person about them, that's when it becomes an offence. And it's entirely appropriate that that should be against the law, because every time you do that, you damage us all. You damage everyone in society. You damage the fabric of this country when you say to people that they're not as good as you because of their religion or their ethnicity or their sexual orientation or whatever it might be. It's not okay, and it's time we shut it down, and we shut down the nonsense that has been going on online about this as well. We've been told that this bill overturns the burden of proof. I'm a criminal barrister. I work only in criminal defence. I deal with this issue every day. There's no way I would stand in this chamber and say it's okay to overturn the burden of proof. This bill doesn't do that, which is why I'm supporting this bill. So let's look at what it does do. It creates presumptions, what we call in law rebuttable presumptions, that exist in so many other pieces of legislation. The Minister gave one example, but I could also use the Misuse of Drugs Act. You could use possessions of articles under the Criminal Justice Theft and Fraud Offences Act 2001. You could use the firearms legislation. If I'm walking down the street with a knife in my pocket and I get arrested by the Gardaí for whatever reason, it's reasonable to require that I explain why I have a knife in my pocket. There is a rebuttable presumption that I have the knife for a nefarious purpose. And so by the same token, if a search is conducted of a person's house and there's all this hateful material, pamphlets decrying particular groups because of whatever characteristic it is, it's reasonable to expect people to explain why they have them. And in the absence of a rational explanation, to say that it's also reasonable to conclude that they have them for a nefarious purpose. That's reasonable, and it exists in all kinds of other legislation. So the same senators who are today going to complain about the overturning of the burden of proof need to go back to all the other pieces of legislation that exist in the criminal canon in this country and start complaining about them too. Let's take people who are walking into shops with foil-lined bags and say that requiring them to explain why I have a device which specifically is designed to defy the magnetic detection devices at the entrance of shops, it's absolutely unfair to require them to explain why they have that. But of course it isn't. And I want to hear the senators who are going to say things like that in this debate tell us why that should be the case. They've told us that that this is something that the search warrants that might be used, for example, are somehow much stronger or much more abhorrent than search warrants that are used in every other area of criminal law, but of course they aren't. And exactly the same provisions that apply to search warrants in all kinds of other areas are required in this bill. The guards have to be able to conduct under reasonable circumstances and with all of the constitutional protections and all of the fair procedures protections that we would expect in any area of law. They need to be able to conduct those searches as part of their investigative powers. Now, if the senators here are saying that the search warrant provisions that are contained in this bill shouldn't be there, then they need to explain to us how this bill isn't going to be toothless if we remove them. They need to explain to us how Gardaí are actually going to do the job that they're required to do to investigate the kind of crimes that this bill creates. They've also told us that recklessness somehow puts it beyond. But as the Minister said in her speech, recklessness is a standard provision within any criminal offence. Because just because you commit the offence and then say afterwards, oh, well, I didn't think it was going to do X, Y, or Z, that's not good enough. We require a certain level of thinking things through of every member of society, in whatever area it might be. And recklessness is a standard provision that you get in most criminal offences existing in the law in this country. So by the same token, if you're unhappy with the recklessness provisions in this bill, you need to complain about them in every other offence that exists in Ireland. So again, go away with the rubbish on that as well. The other thing that I've heard people talking about is how possession of because there's a provision in the bill that possession of material, even if it isn't distributed, can tend to be an offence as well. And somehow this is another area where this is thought policing or thought crime. Again, absolute nonsense. Again, if you're in possession of material, and by the way, it's not illegal to be in possession of material, it's been illegal to be in possession of hateful material without any explanation, without any reasonable basis for having it. So if, for example, the guards come and search my home and I have a number of articles that might be hateful in some people's views, but they're letters to all the TDs or all the senators or all the councillors or whatever it is, that's a reasonable explanation, for example. But if I've got boxes and boxes of pamphlets decrying a particular group, then that is not reasonable. And what this bill does actually in quite a delicate way is finds the balance between that really important principle of freedom of expression, freedom of speech that we all enjoy and we all need and this country needs, and on the other hand people who seek to abuse that and misuse that. And in fact, I hope the provisions that are down in relation to hate crime will lead to the Gardaí perhaps using the powers that they have more effectively. So the hate crime element of this bill creates a specific aggravated offence in a number of different areas: criminal damage, public order, assault, and the Non-Fatal Offences Against the Person Act. And the Minister mentioned this as well. In fact, I think that there are times when, and one of the offences that is covered by that is the offence under Section 7 of the Criminal Justice Public Order Act 1994, which is the distribution of images, for example, or other material that might be offensive. We know that happens all the time. And yet the Gardaí haven't taken action, I think to the frustration of many people. But the reality is that this now will create a specific offence of where that is done with a hateful intent, that is a specific offence. And that's really, really important. The word intent that is used there is perhaps central to this bill, because it's not about having internal thoughts. It's not about having a discussion in a reasonable way with your friends. It's intending to spread hate with the intention of causing violence or causing hatred against particular groups. I actually don't understand how anybody can be opposed to that principle. I don't understand how anybody in this House can stand up and say, I don't want there to be a law to say it's not okay to be hateful publicly and to incite that hatred against other groups. I don't understand that. And I would be grateful for those senators who are opposed to this bill to explain to me why that is happening. Minister, I think this is actually a very fine piece of legislation. I'm sure that you will listen at committee stage to proposals that members have to maybe improve the bill, and I may even have some myself. But I think that there are provisions in this that do challenge us in some ways. And one of the issues that's been raised is the definition of gender, for example. I don't agree with the submission that this is somehow defined how we, or changed how we define gender in Irish law. The definition is specifically limited to this bill, and it's very broad. It is broad to the extent that it includes anybody's interpretation of their own gender. But they are exactly the people who fall outside the norms of how we interpret gender are exactly the kind of people who frequently fall victim to hate crime, hate speech, and victimhood generally in society. So it's entirely reasonable that that definition should be as broad as possible and widen it as far as it needs to go to include as many people who might be victims under this legislation as possible. It doesn't mean that you can now register under any, for example, under the Civil Registration Bill or Act as many genders as you want. That's not what it means. And it's really important that it's not represented in that way. What this is, and the Minister said that any of the factors involved in this will be seen as an aggravating factor in sentence by any judge in this country today. But what this does is it writes it down in black and white, or black and green as the case may be, and it says to anybody who's in a protected characteristic, we recognise that you are vulnerable. We recognise that today things will be said and done to people in the characteristics listed out in the definition section of this bill. We recognise that things will be done and said to you today that are unacceptable and divisive and hurtful and harmful. And we also are saying in black and white that we don't accept it, we will not accept it, and we will create specific offences that deal with it, and we will prosecute people who do that, and they will suffer the rigours of this bill because that's the way it should be.
Thanks very much indeed, Senator.